sorry. Okay, the history of freedom. Okay, sorry. Wait a minute. I think I have to go back. Okay. Uh, if you're going to talk about freedom as a tradition, you associate it generally with the liberal movement without having to say that the liberal tradition is the best tradition. I'm not saying that, but it is just to be able to demonstrate that at the very heart of the liberal tradition is humanity's search for their freedoms. And we will try to expound that a bit and see whether or not they would get reconciled with the way we understand freedom within our Christian tradition, especially expounded in the biblical tradition. Of course, when we speak of the narrative of liberalism, it started somehow with the intellectual freedom that emerged particularly during the time of the Renaissance. Okay, great thinkers like Robert Bacon, an English scholastic philosopher and scientist, and one of the most influential teachers of the 13th century, actually was clamoring for a certain space because everything was under the control of the church, okay, under the leadership of some people who wanted to have control about everything, about what people know, what people should study, and what people should be able to define as truth. And of course, during this time, there were those who attempted and claimed, no, our mind should be free to pursue real truth and not what has been, in a way, imposed upon us by some authorities of the state or of religion. So Roger Bacon, you have also Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer best known for his astronomical theory, heliocentrism. Okay, he talks about he actually tried in his own scientific research, was able to prove long-standing theories, that people believe that everything revolved around the earth because they say that, you know, humanity is the center of the universe and therefore everything revolves around that. And they immediately translated that to how they understand cosmology. Okay? So the world therefore would have its center on earth and everything revolved around that, including the sun. But he said, no, the contrary is true. Okay? It is the earth that goes around the sun. Okay. And Galileo, an Italian physicist astronomer, who with German astronomer Kepler initiated the scientific revolution. Okay? So they have to be able to claim that the human mind can still explore through science so many things that we have not really discovered, so many things that we have not understood yet before. Okay. And then of course you have so many other thinkers like Isaac Newton, okay, an English physicist, mathematician, okay, and natural philosopher, okay, as a continuation of the tradition that was started during the Renaissance period coming from Roger Bacon. So intellectual freedom has been in advance, and especially toward the period of the Enlightenment, you see that great thinkers would say that religion should not impose itself on the free exercise of the mind, and that religion therefore should be put aside and be allowed to practice within the private enclaves of particular historical religious traditions. Okay, so where do we find new expressions of this kind of freedom? I think intellectual freedom is something that is asserted in many places now in researches, academic freedom, etc. That's very, very important for people to have. Okay? No one holds the complete and total truth. Everyone participates in the search for truth. And therefore, people should be given the freedom to do that. Second is about religious freedom. when you have a particular context when everything is run by a religious institution, like the Roman Catholic Church, for example, during the time, the Holy Roman Empire, people were not allowed to exercise uh, alternative ways of appreciating God, alternative ways of worshiping God, alternative ways of following their own, the dictates within them of how they should be able to live out their religious identity. There were so many in the history of the church who actually fought for their own freedom of religion. Many of them, at least the church, would say they have been heretical, and some of them were even actually exterminated and judged to be heretical, and therefore they deserve to die, especially during the time of the Inquisition. Okay? Okay, following a different criteria and basis, moral basis for doing such, okay, the state, in collaboration with the church, actually felt justified for exterminating individuals who would not abide by what society actually would hold as its own religious truths. Because religion was believed to be a cement, to organize society. And if you have so many different religions, that will weaken the structure of society. And so therefore, they were not allowed to deviate from what the state would consider as acceptable forms of religious beliefs. But of course, we see that within this particular period of history of the church, there would always be people who would voice out against that. And this became very prominent, especially during the period of the Reformation, at least in the West. Okay? You know the story of Martin Luther, okay, who German theologian and became a religious reformist. He was an Augustinian priest, actually, who came up with his own thesis, rejecting many churches' assumed beliefs and teachings. Henry VIII, no, for a peculiar reason related to his desire, to get married, okay, and have a son who could be an heir, actually had to found his own religion in England, which eventually became the Anglican Church of England. And you have, for example, uh, John Calvin, okay, the, uh, the great systematizer of Protestant theology, okay? And we know that his writings somehow have pointed to Protestantism as responsible also for the emergence of capitalism, okay? You speak about John Knox, okay, who was from Scotland, just like Adam Smith, David Hume, and many other great thinkers. Actually, he was the one who fought for uh, religious freedom in their particular countries. Okay, apart from the controlling hands of the dominant religion during the time. Okay, so we see these continue to find expressions. Where will you find expressions of this kind of freedom? Can you respond to that? Anyone? Yeah, so that I may not be speaking all the time here. Would you like to do that? I would like to share. Where do you see expressions of this at the moment? Okay. Uh, Well, I think we just have to go on because I think we just finished that now, okay, just a while ago. So we said that that was actually expressed in at least in the report of the group from the experience of Martin Luther King Jr. You see that as expressed in communist regimes where religion is not allowed, and so particular groups emerge as defending their exercise of religious freedom. Now, the Catholic Church, who used to have some doubts about that, or religious freedom, is now in the forefront of protecting religious liberties. Okay, and you have one document that came out from the Vatican too. Okay, that precisely defend religious freedom. Now we move on to political. Okay, you see uh, another part of the main story of liberalism happened especially with the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789. Okay, that gave way to a political restructuring of society from a monarchical, from a feudal system to one that gives way to a more republican or more democratic system of society. Okay, and so we experience emergence of many different forms of political expressions to be able to pursue freedom. Okay, and we see this in many places. Okay, another is economic freedom. Okay, especially during the time of the Industrial Revolution, the mass production of goods and services, actually that gave way to the creation of factories and the process of urbanization in many places. Like you create city centers where many of these production, okay, and factories were located or now continue to be located. And you see that the corresponding effect of that is uh, the marginalization of some individuals who are impoverished as workers. And yet, this whole story comes from what people would speak about as laissez-faire movement. Okay, uh, leave the market to the market forces and let not the state intervene on economic activities of people. Okay, they have to be left free to engage in the market and according to their own capacity and dictated upon by their selfish interests. Well, that's the teaching of Adam Smith, as we already, in a way, uh, expounded as the founder of liberal capitalism. Okay, we will see that early on, when in the classical perspective, okay, there is a difference between classical tradition with that of the liberal tradition. When you speak of the classical tradition, the emphasis was more given to laws, to regulations. Okay, there was so much stress on commonality. Okay, and people will have to, like for example, even in the seminary, singularity was always held under suspicion. If you always want, for example, you have your you sport a long hair, okay, you want to be, have your own personal expression, you will be actually suspected as having problems, and that could even be a ground for you to be expelled from the seminary, because what is expected is that we all share everything in common, our lifestyle, our way of dressing up, our way of moving should all be the same. Just like in a factory, we are like materials that are being processed in assembly line. Okay, you cannot be, this does not allow deviations. There was also an interest on discipline precisely because people are shaped according to how they should be. Their expected results that should come out of you in a uniform way. So discipline will have to be stressed. Okay, stress on rules and laws. Sabi nga nila, you actually try to keep the laws and the laws will keep you. And that's what many would say in information many years ago. Stress on authority, the ones who regulate the law, who oversees discipline, who ensures commonality is happening, are the superiors. They are the interpreters, okay, and the implementors of such classical tradition. Stress on community, these are done, rules are followed precisely because we live in a community and you cannot just allow individuality to ruin community life. On the other hand, when you speak about the liberal tradition, what is emphasized is freedom. Okay? Here, there is a stress on the uniqueness of each individual person. Okay? You see, the perspective also of Louis Jansen's is coming up here. Okay? Every person is unique. You can never be the same with anyone else. You are very much the same. Okay? Stress on self-pursuit, possession, and expression. Okay? If you feel like doing this, to be able to realize who you are, okay, and be able to express who you are. You're allowed to do that now, even in seminary formation. Stress on personal exercise of freedom. Okay? You have to be responsible, okay, and in a way determine what is best for you in terms of your own growth as an integral individual. Okay? Kaya dati-dati, pagka ikaw hindi umaattend ng prayers, tatanggalin ka na talaga sa seminary at the end, especially if you don't have any reason. But now, somehow, there is a fundamental respect for certain recognition of your own situation. Of course, the formators may not be very happy that you actually decide otherwise, other than what the community agreed to have. And of course, you can defend yourself. And if you prove yourself responsible for doing that, then that's okay. But if that is only a result of your own experience of unfreedom, you're so lazy, etc., that would be still a ground. Stress on personal autonomy, okay? The exercise of, of autonomy, okay? It's something, your growth depends not from outside, but from your own internal convictions and principles, okay, as a human individual. Again, human person adequately considered recognizes such autonomy. Kaya nga ang HPAC actually of Louis Jansen's somehow emerges out of this liberal tradition that is more personalist in its own strand. Stress on individuality and isolation, that every individual is so important. It is not only a part of a bigger piece, etc. What is the meaning of freedom? Okay, let's talk about the first. Now, are we free? That's the fundamental question that people ask. Are we free? Even philosophically, this is being asked. What do you think? Can anyone respond? Are human free? Are human beings really free?
Not really, Father. We're not absolutely free.
In what way do you say that the human person is free? And in what way do you say that the human person is not free?
Father, can I quote that? Can I quote from Socrates?
Go ahead.
Man is free, but everywhere he's enchained. For instance,
Oh, okay.
if that person who that is in prison, he can free to go out, but only in his mind. But physically, he's not free. Something like that. There's a limitation of our
Okay,
freedom.
so
Yeah, yeah.
therefore, it is important to understand what do you mean uh, by freedom when you define whether or not human beings are free. Okay, that's what we'll try to do that. Relationship between freedom and responsibility. Okay. Of course, before I move into that, okay, in philosophy, like you will have a good number of philosophers who have actually tried to answer that fundamental question. Fundamentally, ontologically, are human persons free? Okay? So, like Merleau-Ponty, for example, would say, uh, we are not free in a way in many aspects of our life. There are so many things that happen in us that are not, consequence of our choice. For example, we are born Filipino, or some of you are born Papua New Guinean, another are born Vietnamese. That's not your choice. You were actually thrown into that reality. You are not free to choose your parents. You're not free to choose your color. You're not free to choose many other things that you experience in your life. But according to her, eventually, uh, you may decide, to uh, to do something with that uh, initial conditioning or determination that you experience in your life. Uh, how far can you do that? That is the moral question that may have to be asked later on. Okay? Like for example, you are not free to choose your gender, okay, or your sex. You were born a man, and yet you see that something else is strong in you, and that you can actually choose even to alter your biological genitalial condition. Okay? Kaya nagpapa-sex change, etc. Ang tawag nila doon, gender alignment. Sabi nila, hindi naka-align yung aking gender sa aking sex. Kaya ang gagawin ko, i-align ko yung gender ko sa sex ko. Okay? Ay, babali. I-align ko yung sex ko si gender ko. Kaya women or men becoming like women and developing even genitalia of women in an artificial way. Okay? So let's move on and check how much can we experience that freedom. What we would have to speak about at the moment is whenever we experience freedom, there is always a corresponding responsibility. The level of freedom one has all corresponds to the level of responsibility that he also has in terms of accountability. In our lives, there are so many restrictions and freedoms that we experience. External constraints are very much experienced in many different ways. Socioeconomic constraints. You want to be a doctor, but you cannot because you don't have money. Okay, that's already a socioeconomic constraint. Okay, you have political constraints. For example, you want to vote and elect the president in 2022, but you're only 15 years old. So that forms part of your political constraints. Cultural constraints. For example, uh, you want uh, to to do something within your particular tradition, and yet there are certain laws that prevent you from doing that. Okay? Religious constraints. For example, sabihin nila, sister, I want to be a priest, but you cannot, at least in the Roman Catholic tradition, precisely because you're a woman. So these are experienced in many different ways. Some would matter so tremendously, others would only be light in terms of their consequences in the way we live our lives. But aside from the external constraints, there are also more internal constraints that we experience. Psychological blocks. We experience traumas, phobias that to some extent condition us to behave the way we do. And sometimes we're not even aware of them. And that is the reason why psychological processing would be very important for us to identify such blocks and be able to deal with that more maturely as a human person. There are spiritual blocks, personal sinfulness. We want to be good, and yet we experience our own vulnerabilities and sinfulness and fall short of our own expectations. Ontological blocks, the natural constraints that we experience within us, that somehow um, that to a great extent we have never chosen, but they have been already conditioned, they have already been put in our own constitution as a human person. When we speak of freedom, especially in the personal level, which is very important for us to discuss, okay, old moral theology courses normally would only pay attention to this. Okay, if you're going to look at the book of Paul Glenn in philosophy, mainly from the scholastic tradition, the main focus is trying to understand freedom in the personal level. But our own appreciation of freedom goes beyond the personal level. But it does not neglect this dimension as well. We talk of freedom in a more general terms, economic, political, cultural, but it is also important to connect this in the exercise of personal freedom in the personal level. Okay? So when you speak about responsible action, it has to be determined how free are we in our own way of doing them. For example, they say that there are certain things that minimize or somehow destroy our own responsibility. For example, physical restraint, external force, or incapacity actually may lessen our own freedom or even destroy our sense of responsibility because we never had freedom to exercise such. Like, for example, uh, you want to attend Mass, but you have been incarcerated, okay, and there are no Masses in the prison. Of course, now they're trying to offer that. So you cannot do what you want to do precisely because there are physical restraints, and that you will not be held responsible for that, okay? But there are also like emotional restraint or passion that may actually diminish or even destroy responsibility. Can you give me an example of an emotional restraint that somehow frees the person to become responsible because when he did it, there was no freedom? Anyone?
Psychological incapacity, Father.
Okay, can you demonstrate that in what particular case?
For example, in the case of annulment,
Okay,
um, one of the valid reason in order for a marriage to be annulled is the psychological incapacity of the
uh-huh.
person, because he is not in control of his actions. That's
Okay,
why, though I believe, I don't know if I'm mistaken, but
yeah,
I believe even in the canon law, uh, psychological incapacity is one of the the what do you call that? One of the grounds for a marriage to be declared invalid or annulled.
yeah,
So
but it is
yes,
actually more
Father.
specified because the problem sometimes with psychological incapacity. What do you exactly mean when you say psychological incapacity? If it is connected with the exercise of a real freedom of the person, inability, for example, to exercise his freedom, then that may be considered so. Because what is actually very important, especially in defining responsibility in the commission of any particular commitment or action, has always something to do whether we have a full knowledge of it, we have a full consent of it, and that the real thing really happened. Okay. Uh, one, of course, ground for annulment is when you were forced, you were so afraid because you were actually like shotgun marriages. Okay. You have to marry my daughter or else I will blow your head. Of course, when you're so afraid and then you venture into something to which you enter yourself into a commitment that is actually considered null and void, and that you are deprived of freedom and therefore you don't have any responsibility for that. Okay, like for example, you see, uh, can you, for example, you see uh, somebody, for example, you have a husband, you have a wife, and then you see your wife, you know, uh, caught in the act, and you happen to kill the wife. Does that remove responsibility? That only
Actually,
mitigates. Yeah.
in in our penal law,
Yes.
there's a certain provision that if someone is caught, for
Yeah.
example, in the action of uh, having a carnal knowledge with someone,
Mhm.
and it so happened that he killed the the wife and the the other person, the there is what they call this, the punishment will be
Yeah.
downgraded into
Mit-
distierro.
you call that mitigating circumstances.
Yes, mitigating
Okay.
circumstances.
So it
Yes.
does not destroy responsibility fully, but it only actually lessens responsibility. Okay? That's why the person may still be held responsible, but mitigated punishments will be given because the level of his freedom somehow is decreased during that particular reality. Okay, next is intellectual restraint. Ignorance. I do not know that there is such a law. Okay, can you be held responsible for that? What do you think? Of course, the law, the legal system will always tell you ignorance of the law
Excuses no one.
excuses no one, isn't it? Okay?
Yes.
Ignorantia
Yeah.
legis non
Yes.
excusat.
See, oh, you're studying law, huh? Very good. So, but morally, actually, you can speak of a certain ignorance, okay, that would remove responsibility, but others would only diminish it. You have to be able to distinguish vincible ignorance from invincible ignorance. For example, I happen to inject, you know, like somebody who is a doctor injects something to the patient and the patient died. Okay, would he be accountable to that? Okay, that kind of ignorance. And then he would say, "I do not know." That ignorance has to be evaluated whether the doctor has capacity to double check and to be able to know the condition and also to be able to know the drugs, etc. better. Okay? And if he did not make uh, due diligence and that resulted uh, to the death or etc., that doctor will be held responsible because that's not invincible ignorance. That is a vincible ignorance. He could actually have done something to be able to overcome his ignorance. Okay? In the same way, for example, na sasabihin mo, what other examples? For example, uh, uh, may nakita ka, you saw something, you're a hunter, and you see something, a moving object there, and then uh, binaril mo, you shoot the target, and, but you were not so sure what that target is, then you will be held responsible because you could have actually overcome your ignorance about the facts. Okay, de facto and de jure. You have to be able to check whether there is a presence of that reality. You have to investigate the reality, and then you have to be able to investigate also the law, the presence of the law, and that is vincible ignorance, and therefore you will be held accountable to that. But there are certain situations when you do not know. You cannot know. For example, a 5-year-old boy happens to play with the gun of his father and then shoots a friend. That boy can never be held responsible because he does not know that and he has no way to overcome that. The one who will be accused is actually the father who owns the gun because he could have prevented the son from playing with it, etc. Another element is social restraint, social pressure. Okay, normally social pressure is something that may diminish responsibility, but normally it does not remove social responsibility. Okay, so in the personal level, it is important to note that uh, the more free you are, because you are able to know better, and all that, okay, in your own exercise of your freedom, the more responsible you become. That the less responsible, the less free you are, the less responsible you become. Okay, that's the general rule. In the structural level, okay, we have seen that in the context of societies, societies could be ruled by absolute rulers, authoritarian regimes, okay, or very legalistic in the perspective of organizing society. Okay, you see that in contrast to the other type of setting up our moral perspectives and the way we organize society. Okay, you can also have a society that gives uh, permission, becomes very permissible to any exercise of individual freedoms. Okay, basically following only what they feel is good for them, very relative and very subjective. And normally, within this particular framework, as far as morality is concerned, you can define that in terms of emotivism. Emotivism is a moral system that, in a way, uh, that allows that the definition of the good is very mainly based on the way we experience preferences, in psychological and emotional preferences about certain things, basically connected with intuitionism, okay, and subjectivism. In, of course, when we speak of freedom in the structural level, it is always a question of becoming free from, okay? That's one. For example, freedom from being incarcerated. That is one element that we need to pursue. Am I really free from all of this? Am I free from all the blockages that we identified earlier? So that's one, freedom from. But it is also important that when we speak of moral freedom, it is important to also identify freedom not only as a freedom from, but freedom to. Okay? You may have been released in prison, from prison, and yet you're not still free to live your life. You cannot find a job, etc., because you're deprived of us of by the society to pursue what you think is a matter of realizing the full potential of your humanity as a person. Okay? So the main target of our exercise of freedom, understood in terms of freedom from and freedom to, within the context, the social context we live, is always oriented to what we are called to be, and that is to realize the full potentials of our humanity. Anything that will deprive us from realizing that could be considered certain levels of unfreedom. And anything that would actually help us to pursue our full potentials as human person will be will be experiences of freedom to become the best persons that we could be. Okay? So here we see that the individual freedom has to be exercised within the community where he or she belongs. Okay? And that has to be respected. But at the same time, the exercise of freedom of the individual within the context of the community has to be done with a profound sense of responsibility. You are not the only one living in this world. You live with the community, and therefore, the way you exercise your freedom actually should always be in consideration of the community to which you are responsible. So, freedom comes along with duty and with responsibility. Okay? They say your freedom ends when the rights of others begin. Okay? So, and this, in our own particular analytic perspective here at SVST, it is important that as we belong to the community as an individual in the exercise and pursuit of our freedom and responsibility, we have to take seriously the marginalized in our society who too often are not experiencing real freedom in many different dimensions in their lives. And as an individual responsible for the community, especially for those that are marginalized within the community, our exercise of freedom should be able to lead to the liberation and freedom of those who are marginalized in a given society. Okay? And therefore, the laws should be there in the community, not only to actually to define precisely our responsibility, but at the same time to be able to set us also free to do what we think within the bounds of law, and that the laws should always be formulated, okay, on the basis of the weak of society. I think it was President Lincoln who said that those who are weak in life should be strong in law. Okay, the laws are meant to be able to protect precisely the vulnerables in society. Okay, uh, can I beg your indulgence? Can I stay for another 10 minutes? Okay, just briefly. We just have to finish it, or maybe we could discuss this next meeting. I would just like to ask, beg your indulgence for another